yesterday afternoon, and then he got around to actually texting us probably later is my guess, as soon as everyone was sleeping. So that's exciting. Hopefully we can we'll start with prayer and we'll get into that. Josh, am I recorded? Is it going?
Just started it.
Okay, perfect.
I'm just going to switch it back.
Okay. All right. We'll pray. We'll pray for the Clapp family as well. Is there any other prayers? All right, let's open up. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've given us, for the breath in our lungs, for the sun that's shining. God, just make us grateful to be able to be here, to be able to spend some time in your word gathered together as brothers and sisters in Christ. God, we give you thanksgiving and praise for the gift of new life, for Jane and Platt. Thank you so much for a healthy delivery, a healthy mom, a healthy baby. Such a gift. So we ask that you bless the Platt family, that you give Emlyn and Zach as much rest as they can during this time, but that you just give them that overwhelming amount of joy that they have a new daughter in this world. So thank you for that blessing. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so since Zach is further occupied, you guys are stuck with me today. I know. Also, Pastor Howard, who would also be salt too, is in Florida. So he flew out this morning. So he's the one that will be teaching this in the future before Zach gets back. Zach's probably taking about 3 weeks is our current guess. He is preaching this weekend because Joel's in Florida. So, and it's appropriate because it's Life Sunday this Sunday, so he can talk about babies. Yeah. So we are, I hope I got this right. If I didn't, it's going to be very awkward. 2 Kings chapters 5 through 6. Yes? Okay. If at any point you want me to use the microphone, let me know. I know I tend to be louder than Zach. Hopefully I can learn to speak slower than I usually do. I know that Joel and I apparently have the same speaking voice because Bill never has to change our microphones. So I always use Pastor Howard's microphone and not Zach's. So I guess that tells me something about me. But we are going to be covering these 2 chapters. Let me put that on here if you guys want to open up. I know that you guys have been going through the Kings, and I feel really lucky to have gotten these chapters because these chapters contain some really, really awesome stories. We're actually going to be looking at 5 different narratives, and they're just really rich. They're rich with theological principles. They're rich with just great stories. So I'm excited to dive into these with you. I can't believe he left before doing this one, honestly, because these are some really good stories. These are a lot of fun. We are in Elisha's ministry, so this is kind of the part 2 of his ministry. I always think it's interesting that Elisha asked for a double spirit of Elijah's, and we see 14 miracles recorded for Elisha and only 7 recorded for Elijah. So it is kind of interesting that he got literally double the miracles recorded in Scripture. And that's what we're looking at. So we're basically looking at the miracles of Elisha today, 5 of them. So there's Naaman is cured, Gehazi is reprimanded, Acts have recovered, horses and chariots of fire, that's my personal favorite one, and then Ben-Hadad's siege of Samaria. So these are just awesome stories. And so we're going to look at them as stories, because I think that's the best way to kind of go through these. So, telling a story. We're going to tell these 5 stories in kind of the way that I like to tell stories. This was taught to me by one of my professors from Concordia, is when you're telling a story, these are the parts of a story that you need. So you need a situation, you need a stress, you need a search, you need a solution, and then you need a new situation. So I want to give you an example of that story, because then we're going to look for those 5 things in each one of our 5 stories. So I have a picture of myself from 2012 which was shocking to me because that means it's been 10 years since I chose my college, which is actually really weird to think about. So this is a picture of me as a junior in high school. So my situation is that... Thank you. Thank you. So the situation is that I'm a junior in high school, and I have decided that I'm going to be an athletic trainer and go to Augustana College in southern Illinois area. I didn't know for sure if I wanted to be a physical therapist, but I knew I wanted to do the sports. I knew I wanted to work with kids, and that's what I was going to do. I had already decided I'm going to sign the sheet of paper. I'm going to play soccer there, so I have already early decision. The stress came, like that's the backstory. The stressor came when I spent an entire summer at a Lutheran camp, found out that I liked ministry, that I was good at ministry, and that I wanted to do ministry with the rest of my life. That is a stressor when you've already signed a paper declaring that you are going to another college to be on their soccer team for a different degree. So, then started the search. So, I told my parents I wanted to do ministry instead of being an athletic trainer, and they supported me more than they should have, honestly, at the time. We spent an entire week traveling around the country. I went to Ann Arbor, went down to Texas, went over to Nebraska, went over to Chicago, all in 1 week. To see, my parents love me, they must. I know, they didn't have a DCE program, so I knew I wanted to do DCE because I also wanted to get my education degree. And so we searched around the entire country, literally, for the right place for me to go. So this was on that visit, and the solution ended up being Concordia, Nebraska. And I went there so that I could double major in DCE and elementary ed, and they said that they could get me out in 4 years, and they did, which is awesome because everywhere else that I would have needed to spend extra time if I wanted both degrees. So my new situation was that I wasn't going to be an athletic trainer. Instead, I was going to be a DCE and eventually get called here to Grace. So that's kind of how this storytelling works. And we're going to look at these stories in the Bible, and we're going to see the situation, stress, search, solution, and new situation in each one of these. So let's start with the first one. If you guys would, we're at chapter 5, 1 through 14. And I did title all of these stories, and hopefully you see why I titled them what I titled them once we are through reading it. All right, 2 Kings 5. Got it, okay. All right, so I want you guys to be thinking about those 5 parts as I read part of this. I'll stop about halfway through and we'll discuss it. So follow along with me. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Okay, so what's the situation? We have a commander of the Syrian army, so that we know is a man of great valor. He just recently came from a life-changing, career-changing victory, which we think, scholars think was from the Assyrians, okay? So we think that this guy just took down the Assyrians, which would have been a really, really big deal. So this commander of the army just got a really good break. Like, he's living a really great life. But he's a man of valor with leprosy. So that kind of feels paradoxical. This guy has everything he wants. He has military success, but he has this disease that means he can't be around his family, can't be around his friends. He's basically been cursed with this leprosy. So that's the situation and the stress. The stress is the leprosy that's keeping him from other people. Let's keep reading. Now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went and told his lord. Thus and so spoke the Lord from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So you have to imagine, if you were a commander of an army that just had this great victory, you would have resources. And you would probably be looking for a cure for your leprosy, right? That would be the natural next thing you would do. I have this victory, I have this money, now I just need to get healed. How do I get healed? And you've probably looked in a lot of different places, and yet where does the cure actually end up coming from? Or the idea of the cure?
A little girl.
A little girl. I think it's so cool. This little girl ends up being this foreign missionary. Like, she got taken by a raid away from her family, yet she's still speaking about faith in God. She still pointed this foreigner to the Hebrew God, which I think is incredible and really cool. So Naaman, who goes to the king of Syria and basically says, hey, you owe me for this victory, so now will you find me this healing, okay? So the king of Syria agrees, right? Wants to reward this commander, and therefore sends a letter to the king of Israel. It said, so he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. So why is the king of Israel so upset at this request from the king of Syria?
Oh, he was supposed to do it. He was supposed to cure it.
Yes, immediately the king of Israel is like, this is going to lead to war. Because when the king of Syria is sending that big of a prize, he's going with expectation. Like, you are going to heal my commander or else, is basically what that is saying. And this king of Israel says, I don't have the ability to do that. Why would I have the ability to do that? And why does he think I have the ability to do that? And I think that this is often what we do, right? Like, we face an impossible situation and we immediately look at our own resources. We say, do I have what it takes to figure this out on my own? And it's only when we've realized, nope, I am incapable of figuring this out on my own, that then we go and we look for God, or we go to prayer. We use it as a last resource instead of being like, the king of Israel has access to God's prophet, right? So you would think that would come to his mind. But no, he tears his clothes, he's distressed, he's grieving, he's angry, he's all of these emotions. He's a mess because he doesn't remember that he can just go to God's prophet. He doesn't actually end up going to God's prophet. Elisha is the one that comes to him. So we keep on reading. It says, But when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. You see, that's kind of like a jab, right? It's like so that this foreigner can know there is a prophet in Israel, because apparently you don't. That's what it sounds like to me, at least. Apparently you forget that I'm God's prophet and a true prophet, but this foreigner will know, at the very least. So send him my way. Okay? So Nahum came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elijah's house. Okay, so if you're Nahum in this situation, right, you've searched for a solution and you think that you have found a solution, right? You have found this the king of Israel, and this king of Israel has directed you to this man of God, this prophet. So you think a solution is right around the corner. But in true human nature, you have a certain perception of how you'll be treated as a foreign dignitary, right? How would you expect Elisha to come and cure Naaman, who would have been a wealthy, successful person?
Kind of like with respect and kindness or
Yeah. I mean,
pomp and circumstance.
some respect, some excitement. It would have been like a doctor that gets to work on a professional athlete. You know, like, oh wow, like I get to work on, I don't know, Tom Brady. Like that's so cool. Like I will be known as the doctor that healed Tom Brady. You know, like that would be really cool. So that is kind of what Naaman's expecting. This guy's gonna be thrilled that he gets to heal me. Okay? That's not the kind of greeting he gets. Because guess what he also is? Even though he's a successful commander, he's also an unclean Gentile. Okay? So because he's an unclean...
With leprosy.
Yeah, with leprosy.
Yeah.
There is that. He's an unclean Gentile with leprosy. So every part of God's command would say that he's not allowed in Elijah's house or even his presence. And he decides not to break God's law for this man. So we keep on reading. But when Elijah, the man of God, so Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elijah's house. So Elijah sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper." Okay? So we know exactly what he was expecting. He was expecting this big, public, awesome healing. Okay? He wanted the whole world to be talking about how cool his healing was. And he went away angry, even though he was just promised healing. Right? He was just told what to do, promised healing, and he went away angry. Are not Abana and Pharpar, I don't know how to pronounce those, I'm sorry, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So these rivers of Damascus were known to be the most beautiful on earth. They were clear, they were pure, they were healthy, they were safe to drink, they were beautiful. So he's saying, I could have just washed in the beautiful river. Instead, he brought me here to the Jordan River, which is mucky and muddy and dirty and not drinkable. And he's upset. Why would I wash in this river? This is gross. I don't want to be here. So he turned and he went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Okay, so I think this is just such an incredible story, mostly because of how unexpected things happen. So we finally do get the solution. He washes. They think it was a lot of different parts of this suggest that the leprosy was only on a part of his body. So he was only dipping a part of his body in the Jordan. And yet he thinks it's about the quality of the water, right? And it just is such a good allusion to what? This whole story. It's a good allusion to baptism. Because it's not about the water, right? Like, we're not Catholics, we don't believe that it's about the water. So it's not how clear the water is in Damascus versus the Jordan that matters. What matters was the word of God that was spoken. And in this case, Elijah is speaking a word from God that he will bring healing. So you have water and you have word, and what does it make? It makes the flesh of a little child. It makes cleanliness. It makes him clean. It brings healing and new life. So I think it's just this really cool Old Testament parallel to baptism that is truly beautiful. And it's one of those things that we need to come to expect the unexpected. The new situation is going to come a little bit later. But what I think we can really gain from this entire story, if we're looking at the narrative itself, is to expect the unexpected. Because I think there's a lot of people, especially I'm going to just throw my generation under the bus, that expect healing in a certain way. And when that healing doesn't come, the result is anger. So I think of people in my life that want healing, and it doesn't come in the way that they expect, right? And maybe you've had this in your own life. You want healing for something, or you want healing for someone, and it does not come in this lifetime. Or it doesn't come as quickly as you would like, and it's easy to become frustrated. On a bigger scale than that, though, is the reality of sin, right? Because we are dead in our sin and our trespasses, but we still have pride that so many of us cling to. And so instead of being humble and repenting and getting baptized and coming to trust in Jesus for salvation, we walk away angry because we want to do things our own way. We don't want to humble ourselves. And Naaman was angry because he was being asked to humble himself. And so many sinners are walking around not believing in God, not coming to Him, not trusting Him, because the salvation isn't coming the way that they want. They want a way to earn it or some other way, but just trusting in Jesus doesn't seem like the way that they want to go. Maybe they don't like the church, they don't like this Jesus person, and yet that's the only way that they would actually find real healing. It's just the unexpected. Yeah?
What you're saying is very broad.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that a man,
Yeah.
but man is also driven by God. So you cannot make that assumption.
That what?
The assumption that all man is bad. If men believe in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you preach it. You have sinners who come and repent. You cannot make that assumption of man.
Yeah, so
All men, that's what you're saying.
So yes, there are men all over that are sinners. We're all sinners,
Yes.
right? And so some of us are willing to humble ourselves and trust in Jesus,
Yes.
and others are too proud to do that, so they don't come to know
Well,
Jesus.
they don't know of God either.
Some of them are prideful and
That's
don't come.
what I'm saying.
Mhm.
How am I going to say this? You're making some assumptions. You just can't make it that broad. You've got to say some of us are this and some of us are that.
Yes,
That's what
and I do believe that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so that is this situation, to expect the unexpected. Now we move on to the new situation, which is going to be this narrative. I'm calling it Achan Round 2, and hopefully you'll see why. And hopefully you remember that story. We're starting in verse 15. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him. And he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. But he said, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mules load of earth. For now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this manner. He said to him, Go in peace. Okay, so this part's a little strange. Basically, Naaman comes back to Elijah's household and says, I believe in your God now. This is the only God that I want to serve and the only God that I want to worship. And so Naaman offers Elijah this huge reward, it would be the equivalent of $80,000 plus a bunch of fine clothing. So a ton of money for the reward for this healing. And Elisha refuses the reward, and then he says, well, at least give me dirt. Why would Naaman want dirt to bring back home?
You could worship on what Israel had.
Yes, but doesn't that sound strange?
What did you say?
Yeah. So he wants Israelite dirt because that is the Old Testament understanding. They thought that the national borders determined your God. So in order to worship the God of Israel, he wanted a bunch of Israelite dirt, right? And we don't actually see if Elijah responds to that request or not, but we do know that you can serve God outside of those national borders, obviously. He also asked for permission to do something kind of strange. He asked permission to go into a temple of a foreign god, which this would have been the god of thunder, god of storms, and to basically be able to worship there, but to be able to do that without condemnation. And Elijah's response is, "Go in peace," which seems strange because we know that commitment to God should be uncompromised, right? So it's a little bit confusing. And the commentaries I read about this wasn't saying that Elijah was saying there was nothing wrong with that. But what we can assume is that Elijah holds God's people to a higher standard. So believers are always held to a higher standard. God's people is always held to a higher standard. So Elijah wasn't going to say to this new believer, "You must follow all of our laws perfectly in order to be accepted by God." So he told them to go in peace. So it sounds like it's compromising, but really I think what we can learn from it is that believers, God's people, are always held to a higher standard than unbelievers and foreigners. So that kind of explains that part. Is there any questions? Yeah.
And also, it says that when my master enters the temple of Ammon, to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm. So in other words, he is a civil servant. His master is requiring him to be there. So that's like the law where we have to follow our leaders, even though we may not agree with what they're doing. And this man was saying the same.
Yeah,
In that way.
Yeah, he's basically saying the realities of my life are going to force me to do this. Please basically pardon me, show me mercy when that happens. Yeah, yeah.
Also,
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it right. He says you have to obey my laws. You have to believe in my God.
Mm-hmm.
Laws are a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And because some people carry out the laws and some don't. So I think what they're really saying, you have to believe in my God.
Mm-hmm. That is absolutely the most important part. And we see that conversion happen, right? He says, "I believe in the one God and I will serve no other gods." So that's the important part. We have this new reality, we have this new situation and conversion. Okay, so Naaman has gone from him a short distance. Gehazi, the servant of Elijah, the man of God, said, "See, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian, in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi followed Naaman. And when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot and to meet him and said, "Is all well?" He said, "All is well. My master has sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing." All right, so here we have the situation. The situation is Gehazi would have been a part of this entire exchange between Naaman and Elijah. He might have been that messenger that was going back and forth between them, okay? So Gehazi has seen the offer on the table, which is more money than he's probably ever seen in his entire life. So Gehazi gets basically that green-eyed monster, right? He's very jealous, very greedy, and wants that prize for himself. And when he sees Elijah not take anything from the Syrians, he wants to change it. He wants some for himself. And I can imagine at this time, there's Syrian raids happening all the time. We hear about the Syrian raids. It's very likely that Gehazi had family or friends that had been affected by the Syrians. We don't know his family background, but we can assume that his neighbors, his family, his friends, somebody in his life has been affected by the Syrians negatively. So these are his enemies. And if he's getting offered money from them, I'm pretty sure he'd want to take it, right? It would be like if someone hurt your family or hurt your friends, and they were willing to kind of cash out and pay you back for some of it. You might be inclined to take it. So, what he does, this stress, is that he gets this greed and he follows Naaman, and he lies. Okay? So Elijah never actually had this situation happen, right? So no one came to Elijah wanting hospitality, and he had to turn away because he didn't have enough food. So this is all just a scheme to get part of the money that Naaman offered. Now, a talent of silver is what he asked for, and 2 changes of clothing. Is that a lot? Not in comparison to what Naaman had. So this would have been a very modest ask, okay? So Gehazi's not asking for the whole reward. He's just saying, you owe us a little something, and I'm going to take it, okay? So that is he's searching that out, okay? Naaman said, be pleased to accept 2 talents. So he doubles the reward. And he urged him and tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing and laid them on 2 of his servants. And they carried them before Gehazi. And when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house, which actually could be temple, and put them in the house, and he sent the men away, and they departed. He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? Okay, so Gehazi has his reward. He has 2 talents of silver. He has 2 changes of clothes, which would have been worth a lot of money. What do you think he's feeling when he gets asked this question? Okay, I'm sure we can all think of situations in our lives where we've been caught in a lie, okay? I can think of times in my adult life where I've been caught in a white lie, where I said I did something and I actually didn't, or I hadn't done it yet, or something of that nature, right? He also knows that he works for a prophet, which is what makes this response that he gives a little more questionable. So he says this. He said, your servant went nowhere. Okay, good answer, right? It reminds me of a 3-year-old, right? Like when you catch a child when they have cake all over their face, and they're like, did you eat the cake? No, I would never. And it's all over their face, and you can just see it. So, obviously Elisha knows better and doesn't believe him. But he said, did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? So he had this vision. He knew exactly what happened and exactly what lies were said. Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? So he basically asked this question to his servant. Was it the time to be greedy? Was it the time to take things? Was it the time to focus on physical belongings? No. God just worked a miracle in this man's life. We now have a person that believes in our God because of this miracle, and yet he wanted payment. Is this the time to focus on physical comfort and belongings? So there is a solution to this, and it's not a good one. It's a bad consequence. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow. Not good. Yeah, that's not a good outcome for Gehazi at all. Where we go?
Sorry for the descendants, though, that were also cursed.
Right, and the interesting part about this is that leprosy isn't genetic. So the idea that this is kind of the curse that is brought is very fascinating, because it meant that his descendants would always be in the presence of sickness, because that's the only way you get leprosy. It's not genetic. So it's a very interesting kind of curse that is brought upon him. We also don't think he was completely isolated from people like most lepers, because in chapter 8, you'll actually see him come back up. Gehazi will come back up. And there's 2 explanations. Either he was allowed to stay in the presence of others for whatever reason, maybe because it was a curse, it wasn't as contagious. No one really knows. More likely, it's not chronological. So potentially, this curse happened before, or this curse happened after the events of chapter 8, and we just don't know about it. the entire 1st and 2nd Kings is kind of all mumbled up. It's not all chronological. So we don't actually know exactly when Gehazi would have become a leper. But we can make assumptions. What I find crazy about this is that Naaman is cured, right? And he's a foreigner, and he ends up believing in God. And then the Hebrew, right, the Israelite, is cursed with the same thing for his act of unfaithfulness. It's very interesting. And it shows, again, that God doesn't pick favorites, right? And it makes me think about when I'm caught in a lie, right? Do I double down on it like he did? Because that's what he did. I went nowhere, even though he knew he was caught. Even when we are caught in our lies and in our sins, do we try to find a way out? Do we try to blame or trick or deny? And I think a lot of times denial comes the fastest, at least for me, because it seems like the one I can get away with the easiest. And so this is pretty convicting for me. When I'm caught in my sin, when I see my sin, even if I'm not caught by others, when I see my sin, when I recognize sin in myself, do I turn to confession first, or do I turn to blame, denial, all those other vices? So, that is why I say Achan round 2 for this one, though. Because remember what happened to him. Does anyone remember the story of Achan? He's the one that stole from the plunder in Jericho, hid it all, and then his entire offspring, descendants, and himself are all publicly killed for that sin, because God said that the plunder was all his. You basically see somebody else selling their soul for greed, for money. Where else do you see people selling their soul for money? I mean, I know you see it in this world, but in the Bible, there are other examples. What? Judas, perfect example. He sells his soul for money. There's another one in the New Testament.
Ananias and Sapphira.
Yes. They also, Ananias, so they also sell their soul, basically, for this greed, for this money. And in Luke, Jesus says you can't serve two masters. You can't. It's impossible. And it leads to a lot of trouble. All right, this one's a short one. This is chapter 6, but it's our next story. Small things matter. We're going to just read this one all the way through because it's kind of a short story, and it's going to seem insignificant. That's why I titled it Small Things Matter. So this is starting in chapter 6, verse 1. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elijah, "See, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there." And he answered, "Go." Then one of them said, "Be pleased to go with your servants." And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, "Alas, my master, it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, "Take it up." So he reached out his hand and took it. Okay, feels like a very small miracle. He saved an axe head. Okay, it's not something that normally you would write home about. But let's look at the situation, okay? The situation is that we can assume that Elijah is making the prophet numbers grow, right? Because the prophets that are studying under him are saying, we don't have enough room anymore, we have to build another house. And that's a really good sign in ministry usually, right? If we got too big for that sanctuary, we have some good problems happening, right? So if we need to go out and buy it or build a whole other church, that's usually a good sign. Elijah's making amazing things happen. There's a lot more prophets that need basically study room. They need places to live. So they go out to build this new area for the prophets to stay. And as they're cutting down trees, an axe head, which would have just been the sharp edge of the axe, falls into the Jordan. And you see the person that did this is really, really upset. His response, he cries out, "Alas, my master, it was borrowed." Why would that have been a big deal for that person that lost that axe head?
he owed that to the other person that really owned it.
Yes.
He would have had to repay, probably become a slave of the other person to pay for that.
Yeah, they didn't have their own money.
Yeah.
So there would have been no way to repay for this axe head. I mean, he was probably searching for solutions, right? Like, maybe I can blame someone else, maybe I can claim it was an accident, maybe I can ignore it and see if they forget. But ultimately, he would have gone into debt. And a debt that he probably wouldn't have been able to pay, at least without some kind of labor.
Right.
Is it likely that he would have had to sell himself as a slave for an axe head? Probably not, but regardless, it would have put him in debt. And so the reaction of Elijah is to throw a stick in, and the stick, the wood, makes the axe head float, and it's recovered. There's a lot of cool analogies to this as well, of our sin gives us debt, right? And we are saved from that debt through a cross, which is wooden.
Yeah.
So that is kind of cool to think about. But I think the main message that I got from this story is really that God cares about the small stuff. I mean, He really does. When I pray with our children in children's ministry, I ask them to give me a prayer request. That's some of my favorite times, because those prayer requests seem so small to us. And I wish I could just run the prayer requests down to the altar during service so that we can pray for some of them, because they're just like a children going to their father, you know? Like, I wish for dessert after dinner tonight, or I pray for my goldfish to live another day, or there's just been, that was actually one of them last week. But the prayers of a child matter to a father, right? And so even this small debt mattered to God. And I think that that's just really fun to remember. Okay, this is the best one. This is my favorite one. I'm calling it Eyes Wide Open, chapters 6, 8 through 23. Do you see how rich these miracle accounts are? It's just so cool to see Elijah's ministry in action, and to see God work through him. All right, so we're starting in verse 8. Let's set up the situation, because the situation is kind of confusing. It says, once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, at such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God had told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. And the man of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing. He called his servants and said to them, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? Okay, so here's the situation. King of Syria, king of Israel, they're warring against each other. Nothing's new there. But what is new is that now every time the king of Syria tries to make a move, the Israelites already know about it. And that's because Elijah is working with the king of Israel and giving all the intel. Okay? And that intel is actually getting confirmed by Israel's army, who's saying, oh yeah, they were there, like Elijah is telling you the truth. Okay? So that makes the king so frustrated that he thinks there must be a Benedict Arnold in his ranks. There must be a spy that is giving out our location and our plans, because how else do the Israelites keep knowing where we're going? So the king of Syria is getting desperate, and he's getting angry. And he finds out why all his plans have been getting foiled. It says, and one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elijah the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. And he said to him, go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him. It was told him, behold, he is in Dothan. So he sent there horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. So there's a lot of things to unpack in just that amount. That town is a really small town. So there's not a fortress, there's not an army there. So it would have been really unusual for a Syrian army to go there by night and surround it with chariots and horses. That wouldn't make sense. In war, you took down the big cities. That's how you won, right? You don't circle a small town. The only reason why he's circling this small town without a lot of defenses is because he wants to destroy Elijah. It's a personal attack. It's not really an act of war. It's, I want that specific person gone so that he stops ruining my plans. Okay? So because it's this personal attack, you would think that the king of Israel wouldn't let this happen without any kind of defense for Elijah, but he does. So most likely, the army of Syria would have had to pass right through. So they think the king of Israel must have given them the all clear. Like, sure, if you want to destroy Elijah, destroy that city, go for it. So they don't protect him. They just let the army of Syria circle on up, and they're about to destroy this town. Okay? So it's a very bad situation for Elijah. He's not getting defended by his king at all. It said, when the servant of the man of God, which could be Gehazi still, rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. Can you imagine that wake-up call? You wake up and you see horses and chariots surrounding your small town that has no defense. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? And this is a good memory verse. He said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. That doesn't seem to make sense, right? He's looking at a huge army that is all against them. And yet Elijah's claiming that who is with us is more than who is with them. Which would have been a big deal. That means they would have won. That's how war worked. Whoever's army was the biggest usually won. So the fact that he was saying our army is bigger than theirs says we have the victory. Okay? But he doesn't see that. The servant can't see that. So Elijah prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elijah prayed to the Lord and said, please strike these people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elijah. And Elijah said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. So, if you don't remember, Samaria is the capital of Israel. So this entire account is incredible. First, we focus on the fact that there's an entire army of God that was hidden from other people's sight that Elijah could clearly see. More people are on our side because I can see the chariots and the horses of fire that are surrounding us and protecting us. Don't you see it? He prays for that sight. And this actually mirrors a lot of different verses. Psalm 125:2 says, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. Isn't that a cool image? He's surrounding us with chariots of fire. We have angels protecting us and guarding us. He surrounds his people. Or Psalm 34:7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Or Zechariah 4:9, then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro. No oppressor shall ever again march over them, for now I see with my own eyes. So if we are made aware of how present God is, how would that change our lives? If we were constantly aware that we have a Father in heaven that loves us, that we have angels fighting for us, protecting us, and guarding us, if we realize the help that is always accessible to us, how would it change the way that we lived?
No fear.
No fear. Exactly.
Okay.
Like Elijah knew he had the victory the entire time. Do you see him freaking out when he saw that army? No. Calm, peace. He knew the help that was available to him. He knew that God was on his side, so he had nothing to fear at all. We look out and we see terrible things happening all over, but do we actually see God's army over that, circling us, protecting us, being there for us? It would change everything if we actually had an awareness of that. If we had an awareness of how much is on our side. We know how much is against us, but do we realize what's on our side? Do we realize the power that we have accessible to us? And that's why I think this is such a powerful story. And this is one of the stories that I love sharing with our youth, because they see what's against them, but they don't always see the power of God. They don't realize what they have. And that's why he prays for sight. And I think we can pray for sight too. God, help me be more aware of the power that you give me and the help that is available to me. Give me eyes to see that. And those prayers will get answered. Elijah's prayer for sight was answered. The servant got to see that they were safe. But then, ironically, what does he pray for the enemies? Blindness. Right, so he says, shut their eyes, and then he personally escorts them, which that's awesome. 10 miles would have been the distance. He's walking them 10 miles, escorting them into the walls of Samaria, which would have been the capital. And we see his response, which is also earth-shattering. I'll bring you, sorry, where were we? We'll read at verse 19. 20, okay, thank you. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elijah said, "O Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see." Okay, so now we're praying for sight again. But now they're going to wake up in a very different area. So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. As soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elijah, "My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?" Okay, so imagine for a second that you are part of the Syrian army. You have just been told your first mission was to go to this small dinky town and basically have a show of force, get at least one man, but if you want to destroy the rest, go for it, okay? So you are going with sure victory. You know that this is not a big deal. I'm going to be home in time to eat dinner. It's going to be fine, okay? So you have total confidence in your victory. Then suddenly, everything goes dark, and you guys apparently went to the wrong place. So you march 10 miles, and when you open your eyes, you're in the capital of your enemy. That strikes a lot of fear, because there was no rules of war back then, right? There was no international rules of war back then. What would happen if an entire army was in the capital of a city? You kill them, right? There's no rules about this. They would get slaughtered, okay? But that's not what Elijah says to have happened. Elijah said, "You shall not strike them down. When you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow, set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." So he prepared for them a great feast. And when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids in the land of Israel. Okay, so Elijah sets a brand new precedent for prisoners of war. They were treated kindly. They were given food, and not even just prison food. They were given a feast, okay? So again, put yourself in the place of this Syrian army. You've just been through a lot of emotion, okay? You've been temporarily blinded, then not blinded, then almost massacred, and then given a feast and a party, and then told to go back home. I mean, that would have been quite the life-changing day. And Elijah's kindness and compassion and mercy on his enemies is a brand new standard. It was never done before, to treat prisoners of war in this way. And so what follows, that new situation, is peace with Syria. Now what's strange about this peace is that it's very short-lived. So even though all of this kindness and mercy happened, we think that was a very short-lived time of peace, because what happens next is pretty bad. Any questions about that one, or that narrative? Okay, because we have just enough time, I think, for the last narrative. And I want to call this one Blame, which is chapters 6:24 through 33. And you'll see that peace ended really quickly. Okay, so whatever peace between Israel and Syria was not long-lasting. Because then we have Ben-Haddad's siege of Samaria. Okay, so it said, after Ben-Haddad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. All that kindness was forgotten, because there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head, which is a worthless piece of food, was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. They were selling dove's dung. Like, it's not a good time. It's a desperate time. Now, as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he said, "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" Okay, so the king of Israel is basically saying, how am I supposed to help? We're all hungry. This economy is really bad. We're in really bad shape. No one has any food. How am I supposed to help you? Both the winepress and the threshing floor would have been outside the city walls. So he's basically saying, do you want me to go out there? Because I would die immediately. Okay, so those are the two options. Okay? The king asked her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.'" So that is a level of desperation none of us have ever encountered. I think I can safely say none of us have encountered that level of desperation. Her response, "So we boiled my son, and we ate him. And on the next day I said to her, 'Give your son, that we may eat him.' But she has hidden her son." Awful. I mean, that level of starvation is, again, something that we can't identify with. We don't know what it's like to be that desperate. It's shocking to me that her complaint to the king isn't that she had to boil and eat her son. It's that it was an unfair treatment because this woman promised and didn't deliver her own son. It's heartbreaking and terrible, and this is an awful, if we're looking at the situation, it's dire, it's bad. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body. And he said, "May God do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elijah, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today."
Why was it Elisha's problem?
Right? Well, that's a really good question. Why was it Elijah's problem? I think this explains human suffering very well. When we are suffering, when we are desperate, who do we usually blame?
Somebody else.
God is a really good answer, yes. So he's blaming God ultimately. But who's the person that represents God in the Old Testament? In that setting, the prophet, right? So I'm blaming God, so then I'm definitely going to blame his prophet, basically. And that's why it's called the blame game. It's not Elisha's fault, although he potentially might have advised the king to not give up. Okay, so that could have happened. We don't have an account of that, but that is possible. It's possible that Elisha was giving the advice to not give up on this siege, okay, because Elisha knows what's about to happen. So we have this blame game going on. The king is really mad. He wants to execute Elisha, okay? Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king had dispatched a man from his presence, but before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" Okay, so the king sends an executor off, says, "Go get Elisha's head. I just promised the people on the city wall," so publicly announced that he's going to murder and execute Elisha. Elisha's a prophet, sees the executioner coming. But what does he also see? He also knows that right behind the executioner is the king. So the king's footsteps are coming right behind him because it seems the king changed his mind. Said, "Just kidding, you probably shouldn't kill the prophet of God." And a more accurate reading of this is actually that the messenger that spoke about in verse 33 is the king himself. So you have the executioner coming in, seeing Elijah and the elders, and then quickly after, you have the king coming in and speaking. It says, "And while he was speaking with them, the messenger